Now let's look at Section 5.8, Handling Samples and Test Items. You must have a procedure for the transportation, receipt, handling, storage, and disposal of samples. You must have a system for uniquely identifying samples. Examples might include location and date of a sample, such as effluent-1 or EFF-1, 01-26 of 19, year, and then a consecutive number, such as 19-10-23, that being the 1023rd sample in 2019, or a unique number assigned by the LIMS system. Samples must be checked when they are received, and if something isn't right, you must contact the client. Procedures and facilities for the proper storage of samples must exist as well. T&I clarifies that there must be a unique ID for each container, including subsamples, unique preservations, and extracts. For example, if sample 19-10-23 is a large container of effluent that is brought to the laboratory and then subsampled, they could become 19-10-23A, 19-10-23B, 19-10-23C, or maybe by test, such as 19-10-23 TSS, 19-10-23 CBOD, or 19-10-23 nutrients. If a sample is digested, it could become 19-10-23A-D. The lab ID must be linked to the field code, and it may be the same thing. It's perfectly acceptable. The lab ID must be durable. It must be a mark on the container. Remember that Sharpie is your friend. And the lab ID must be linked to the sample throughout all testing, including sample preparation. You must have a written policy for what will be checked on the samples when they are received. Information includes the field information, such as field ID, location, time, place, collector's name, preservation type, sample type, as in what tests are going to be performed, and a proper label. A chain of custody could be used for all of that information if provided by the customer. Additional checks that you would want to perform would include that it's the proper container and that there's no leaks, that adherence to holding time has been met, and that there's sufficient sample for the testing that needs to be done. Additional policy requirements would include what to do if it doesn't meet those requirements as set above, and the sample date report qualified if the sample doesn't meet the acceptance criteria. Additional requirements include documentation of preservation. If samples don't meet acceptance criteria, a record must be made, the client must be notified, and you will need to qualify the data. Sample receipt must be recorded as well. This could be a receipt log where lab ID is assigned. Some labs keep a log of the chain of custodies, and I've accepted this as long as all the required information is present. Sample receipt records need to include the client name, the date and time of receipt, the laboratory ID, and identify who received the samples. While all of our samples may be used for legal purposes at some point, this clause refers to those that are sampled, knowing to be a sample for evidence. Most laboratories do not handle known samples for evidentiary purposes. If you do, you must have a procedure for how to handle these samples. The samples must meet storage requirements. If it calls for refrigeration or 4 degrees Celsius, anything above freezing to 6 degrees Celsius is acceptable. You must have an SOP for the disposal of samples, although you can include this in method SOPs as well. One common deficiency is the chain of custody not being complete. If the sample was pulled by someone else and the chain of custody wasn't sufficiently completed and not caught at the time, outside of contacting the client, there isn't much you can do. However, sample receipt information does need to be included. Common missing elements are whether or not the sample was on ice, the temperature of the incoming sample, pH preservation checks if done at sample receipt and not at the time of analysis.